Hello, good evening. Today I would like to review an Indian poet by the name A.K. Ramanujan. So the poems that I am going to review, and these are not actually a review, but more so of a first impressions. So these poems are Looking for a Cousin on a Swing, A River, Of Mother, among other things, Love Poem for a Wife, 1, Small-Scale Reflections on a Great House, and Obituary. So these 6 poems of Ramanujan are in the Civil Services Optionals English Optional Syllabus. And today I was reading these poems, and the very first thing which struck me about Attipate Krishna Swami Ramanujan, A.K. Ramanujan, is that he uses a satirical tone in his poems. And apart from satire, although the titles of his poems might make the reader think that this is a serious poem, or this might have some romantic themes, or perhaps even some insightful revelations, but almost all the poems that I have read in this particular anthology are generally satirical. So let me start with the very first poem, which is Looking for a Cousin on a Swing. My very first impression of this poem was that it seemed like it had a lot of innuendos, and the speaker of this poem, no, not the speaker, the main subject of this poem is a girl who initially is 4 or 5, and then later on she's probably in her early 20s. So there are a lot of innuendos in this particular poem, innuendos like lunging pits. So when he says, when she was 4 or 5, she sat on a village swing, and her cousin, 6 or 7, sat himself against her. With every lunge of the swing, she felt him in the lunging pits of her feeling. So, of course, we at the first glance, you don't think much of it, but then he goes on. And afterwards, we climbed a tree, and she said, not very tall, but full of leaves like those of a fig tree. And we were very innocent about it. So until this point, it's still very unclear whether there are innuendos or not. But the second part of the poem, when she has grown up, it reads, now she looks for the swing in cities with 15 suburbs and tries to be innocent about it. Not only on the crotch of a tree that looked as if it would burst under every leaf into a brood of scarlet figs, if someone suddenly sneezed. So the second part of the poem has some very explicit words and vocabulary, which makes the reader think that this is definitely an innuendo. Some of those words are like crotch of a tree, burst under every leaf, and a brood of scarlet figs. Scarlet, of course, refers to blood. So a lot of innuendos that I felt in this very first poem, which was not expected, since A.K. Ramanujan is a professor of English in Illinois, I think. Chicago, Illinois. The second poem, A River, which in my, I think, second or first year of college in bachelor's, we were asked to read this poem and draw something about it. So this is actually my second reading of the poem, but in context of the very first poem, Looking for a Cousin on a Swing, this second poem gave me some new insights which I didn't have in my very first reading of the poem back in 2019. So in this poem, Ramanujan is focusing, I feel, my very first impressions of this poem made me feel that Ramanujan is not focusing on the river, which is the title of the poem, but is focusing on the poet's response to the river. He says, that in Madurai, city of temples and poets, who sang of cities and temples, every summer a river dries to a trickle in the sand, bearing the sand ribs, straw and women's hair clogging the water gates at the rusty bars, under the bridges with patches of repair all over them, the wet stones glistening like sleepy crocodiles, the dry ones shaven water buffaloes lounging in the sun. The poets only sang of the floods. So this particular poem feels like a dig towards poets about what they consider poetic, and yeah, it feels like a satire on poets. The third poem, titled Of Mother Among Other Things, I was not very clear about what this poem is about, in the sense whether it is a satire or what, but to me it felt like it was Ramanujan's impression on seeing his mother aging. So he refers, like it says, I smell upon this twisted black-boned tree I smell upon this twisted black-boned tree the silk and white petal of my mother's youth. From her earrings, 3 diamonds. Splash a handful of needles, and I see my mother run back from rain to the crying cradles. And it goes on. And at the very final stanza, it is revealed to us that the scene which compels Ramanujan to write this poem is a scene in which he sees his mother bending down to pick up a grain of rice from the kitchen floor. So that made me think that this was Ramanujan's impression of an aging mother, and perhaps his reminiscences of what her youth would have been like. The fourth poem, Love Poem for a Wife 1. This is the fourth poem, right? I think so. Although the title says Love Poem for a Wife, I feel it more inclined towards a complaint and a satire on the said wife. There are, of course, references to relations and in-laws. There are references to quarrels. And very interestingly, the poem begins and ends with references to childhoods. So I'll read the very first and the very last stanza. Really, what keeps us apart at the end of years is unshared childhood. You cannot, for instance, meet my father. He is some years dead. Neither can I meet yours. He has lately lost his temper and mellowed. That was the first stanza. The final stanza reads, Betroth us before birth, forestalling separate horoscopes and mother's first period, and wed us in the oral cradle and carry marriage back into the namelessness of childhoods. So very interesting, the reference to childhood. And this particular line, what really keeps us apart at the end of years is unshared childhood. So this read like references to inconsequential subjects, references to, things like, and reduce the entire career of my recent unique self to the compulsion of some high sentence in his Smilesian diary. I feel like there's a lot of, I think it is a satire on his wife. I don't know if this is talking about his actual wife or not, but it reads like a satire on the wife, or more so a complaint. And then the fifth poem, Small-Scale Reflections on a Great House, again feels to me like a satire on joint families. It has a lot of references to a lot of things. Some of those things are things like library books, neighbors' dishes, bills, products, ideas, beggars, children, daughters, grandchildren, and most importantly, a reference to a nephew with stripes, which of course stripes means stripes here, as soldiers do. And I think the nephew here is dead because he says this, a nephew with stripes on his shoulders was called an incident on the border and was brought back in plane and train and military truck even before the telegrams reached on a perfectly good, chatty afternoon. So that made me think that the small-scale reflections was this reflection was brought about by the death of this nephew, who probably died in some incident. We are not sure whether this is during a war or during peacetime, but the death of the nephew compelled this reflection on what he calls a great house, or in other words, a joint family. So yes, it reads like a satire on joint families again. And the final poem, the sixth poem in this anthology, is titled Obituary. And by the title, you would feel that this obituary is, a eulogy, an elegy on his father. But when you read the poem, you sort of get this idea that he is not really reminiscing his father, but perhaps blaming him. Blaming might be a strong word, but perhaps contemplating his father's death in context of his mother's death, which was brought about by his father's death. So it reads, I will read the last stanza first. For fun and lately in the hopes of finding these obituary lines. And he left us a changed mother and more than one annual ritual. So it strongly implies that his mother also passed away after the death of his father. So perhaps it is a reflection on death, on the banality of life. It has an unserious tone, which is contrary to what you would expect in an obituary. Perhaps he holds his father responsible for his mother's death. It feels like he was closer to his mother than he was to his father, because there does not feel to be a lot of regard in the way he mentions his father. Like, for example, father, when he passed on, left dust on a table of papers, left debts and daughters, a bedwetting grandson named by the toss of a coin after him. So, particularly this stanza, but someone told me he got 2 lines in an inside column of a Madras newspaper. So he gets to know that his father's obituary was mentioned in a newspaper, but then he goes on to add, sold by the kilo exactly 4 weeks later to street hawkers, who sell it in turn to the small groceries where I buy salt, coriander and jaggery in newspaper cones that I usually read for fun, and lately in the hopes of finding these obituary lines. So that's sort of how should I put it? Sort of removes the sacredness of that obituary line. So that was my first impression of A.K. Ramanujan. I was not expecting him to be... I was expecting it to be more reverential, more like an old professor writing romantic poems like the romantics of the 18th and 19th century. But apparently Ramanujan writes a lot of satirical poems. He attacks the established notions on things, on expectations, and he tries to turn them upside down. A very interesting poet. I would like to hear other people's review of his poem, and of course some academic literature on the poem as well, to get a better insight into Ramanujan's poetry. But as of today, this was my review of my first impressions on A.K. Ramanujan. That's it. Thank you.